This is the first episode in a two-part series, and the second series in our latest season covering cold cases across the United States. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are solely the interviewee's own. If you're in need of mental health support, you can reach out to the National Alliance on Mental Illness by calling their helpline at 800-950-6264, texting NAMI to 62640, or emailing helpline at nami.org. In a crisis, call or text 988. This is The Fall Line. On November 6, 2021, 22-year-old Bryan Vladek Hasel walked into Foxtail Coffee on University Boulevard in Orlando. It was a place the young man visited often. Vlad, who'd spent most of his life in Central Florida, had recently returned to the state the previous year and had settled into a routine that included frequent trips to the Foxtail. It's a shop that's popular with UCF students, busy and full of people around Vladek's age. The last few years had been a difficult period in Vladek's life. He'd left the Marines under an honorable discharge after a lifetime of planning for a military career, and he'd moved cross-country to live with various family members and work in different fields, all while the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak. Back home in Florida, Vlad was still isolated. He seemed to be seeking direction. His family told us that he'd gotten very interested in religion and the rejection of materialism, and was focused on trying to help people who were struggling with housing and food insecurity. He'd often spent his limited funds taking the people he met out for a meal and helping out any way he could, something that his loved ones say was in line with his kind nature. But they were concerned, too. Vladek wasn't easy to reach. They had to beg him to carry a cell phone, a basic flip model, so they could reach him in case of emergency. They worried about his hesitancy to discuss what they suspected was depression and his focus on religion. It felt different and more intense than what they'd grown up with. Vlad mentioned vague, big plans, like hiking the Appalachian Trail, but his family wasn't sure what direction he'd truly go in. And when they planned a trip that fall to Tennessee, he decided not to join them. He stayed in Orlando, where he kept to his usual habits, like visiting Foxtail Coffee. The coffee shop was in walking distance of his new home, so the staff knew him, and the visits had become part of his routine. Based on what we've been told by his family, Vladek, that's what he went by, or just Vlad, was always kind and friendly with the employees. But his behavior, which could include pacing or listening to music at a high volume, was sometimes disruptive to other patrons, even through his headphones. The customers occasionally asked the staff to speak with him, and in the past, that was the end of it, and the issue was resolved. To our knowledge, he was never aggressive, rude, or violent with anyone at the establishment. But on November 6, things went further. According to News Nation, a patron had reported Vladek to the staff 2 days before. The main issue seems to have been that he'd placed a pocket knife on the table where he'd been sitting, not threatening anyone in any way, but the patron may have been nervous. The staff had planned to permanently ban Vladek from the establishment, but he left by the time that decision was made. When he returned on November 6th, the police were called to issue the official trespass. According to Night Owl Reconnaissance, a nonprofit dedicated to finding missing persons, it was 8:26 in the morning when an Orange County Sheriff's deputy issued Vladek a trespass warning and asked him to leave. Vladek complied and left the premises after a conversation with police. Per WFTV, this exchange is verified by sheriff body cam footage, and according to Night Owl Reconnaissance, that footage showed Vladek, quote, calmly left when asked and appeared to be walking west toward a nearby Wawa convenience store. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Bryan Vladek Hasel, and his family, who you'll recall was traveling out of state, they wouldn't know that he was missing for 10 more days. It would be even longer before they learned of the existence of that body cam footage, or that Vladek had been asked to leave the premises, an event that they fear may have upset him. Visits to Foxtail were part of his normal routine in a life that had become increasingly chaotic for a young adult who seemed more and more focused on finding himself, through religion, through helping others, through trying to make connections. When his father, Steve, arrived home on November 15th, Vlad was not in their shared apartment. He hadn't picked up a package that had arrived on November 8th, something Steve said his son had promised to do. Food was still in the fridge, and there were no signs his son had been home recently. And his cell phone, the one that his family had to nag him to carry, it was sitting in Vlad's bedroom. This realization began a search that has continued for more than 4 years. The family began by speaking to neighbors and hanging up flyers. They reached out to law enforcement, to the media, to anyone who might help. And they haven't stopped looking. His older sister Bethany, who spoke with us for these episodes, became and has remained an advocate for her brother, working with organizations across the country to publicize his case. She believes that her brother could be anywhere, that he may have joined the unhoused community that he'd been reaching out to in the months before his disappearance, that he could have begun his attempt at walking the Appalachian Trail. With so little to go on, Bethany has to explore every possibility and try to reach as many potential witnesses as she can. There have been no credible tips and no confirmed sightings of Vladek since November 2021. Now, more than 4 years later, his family is desperate for answers. They believe that spreading his story beyond Florida is key to finding out what might have happened after Vlad walked away from the coffee shop that morning, and people in the southeastern United States, and maybe beyond, could have important information that could bring him home. Though Bryan Vladek Hasel spent most of his life in Florida, he grew up in Inverness and then moved to Orlando. He wasn't born in the United States. Vlad was adopted from Russia when he was 5, along with his biological sister Irina, who was 12 at the time. The two joined what their adoptive mother Cheryl describes as a large and blended family. She and her husband Steve both had daughters from their previous marriages and went on to have 4 more children before they adopted Vladek and Irina. By the time Irina and Vladek joined their family, their oldest children were adults and living outside the home. The house was still lively, though. They were busy with church and school and activities like basketball and t-ball and plenty of time outside. The Hasel's youngest children, Bethany and Kristen, were close in age to Irina and quickly grew close to both Irina and Vlad. Cheryl told us that as a child, Vlad was known for his desire to help others, a trait that would follow him throughout his life. She saw that reflected in his dream of becoming a Marine and his interest in reaching out to unhoused individuals in Orlando to see what he could do to assist. And he was searching, his family told us, for ways to do that, and maybe for meaning too. When we spoke with Cheryl Hasel, Vlad's adoptive mother, in the winter of 2025, she explained that she'd been adopted as an infant herself. Though she and Steve had a large family, the 6 children between them, Cheryl told us that she'd always discussed adoption with Steve. It was something that she felt passionate about.
Probably for the 10 years before, I'd say to Steve, even though we have all these kids, I still have this yearning in me to be like my mom, to give to kids that don't have what our kids have, a mom and dad. I want to adopt.
Then, at a homeschool gathering, Cheryl learned about a program designed to sponsor Russian children who've been living in orphanages to the U.S. for a 10-day stay. The purpose was to meet potential adoptive families. When she saw a photo of Irina and Vladek, she felt an immediate connection. Then the Hasels continued contact with Irina via phone and translator and worked for months to be sure that they were financially prepared and to gather all the necessary documents needed for background checks and home studies. They finally made their trip in 2004.
By the time we did get to Russia, there was a dossier on us, a good 2 inches thick of papers. We had to go for fingerprinting, and we were granted the adoption. And we spent the whole month in Russia, and we had brought Bethany and Kristen with us because we wanted them to understand where Vladek and Irina were coming from, what the difference between our home and an orphanage was, and even the country. It was difficult because, like I said, we didn't speak Russian, and the kids, that's all they knew. Steve did take a little class before we left to learn some basics of Russian, like reading it, but speaking it's a whole different thing.
Bethany was barely a teenager, just 14, when her family traveled to Russia, but she still remembers it well. She told us that they concentrated on seeing as much of Russia as they could to understand where Irina and Vladek came from. She also recalls their transition period when they returned to the United States.
It was a big learning curve for Kristen and I. I'm not going to say we handled it perfectly, being the babies of the family and not having that position anymore, I guess you could say. But we grew so much over those first few years together, And I remember when we first got back from Russia in 2004, there was four hurricanes that hit one week after another, like back to back to back, and without power for like a month and a half. Irina and Vladek didn't speak any English besides for a couple basic words. So that was a lot for them to kind of understand what was going on. And, we used like a Google Translate website for a lot with helping communicate. And then through the adoption agency, there was a translator that helped the families that live locally. And we were able to go to her house over the few months leading up to Russia to be able to call Irina and speak with her. And then after the adoption, we were able to continue that friendship with them. And she has a daughter about Irina's age. So being able to go over there and for them to be able to continue to speak the language, because her daughter spoke Russian as well, was really important. But Irina didn't want to continue to speak Russian. She just kind of wanted to let that part of her life go. So over time, she doesn't remember how to speak Russian, just a few select words kind of thing. And same thing with Vladek. They picked up English really quickly. I'd say within about 6 months, they were speaking fluently.
Bethany told us that once Vlad settled into their home, they soon got a sense of his personality. He had a caring nature, he loved sports, and he enjoyed being outdoors.
Basketball. He's always been playing basketball. When in middle school, he was living with my dad, and he would, get my dad out to the court and play basketball with him. And dad's mobility isn't the greatest, but he would still get out there and play. And Vladek was very competitive. He would always get at least one more shot in than dad. There's one memory that always comes to mind, which always brings a smile to my face, and just how funny it whole situation was. He had a friend. He was probably like 8, 9 years old at this time, maybe somewhere around there. He had a friend that lived down the road, and I guess the kid wandered off or something. So there was a helicopter overhead. There was law enforcement going door to door. And once Vladek saw the helicopter and the officer at the door, he admitted that his friend he let stay in the treehouse in our backyard.
Vladek had been sneaking out to the treehouse and bringing his friend sandwiches the whole time. It struck Bethany as funny, but it also seemed like a hint of who he'd grow up to be, someone who was always willing to help. Cheryl said that Vladek was one of the most gentle of her children. When she and Steve eventually separated, that was when Vlad was in middle school and then later divorced. She knew that it affected him, but she said that he seemed more concerned for everyone else's well-being.
When Steve and we separated, and he never shared with me his heartache, he'd come over and he'd be just so pleasant to be around and do things with. We'd bike ride one way and up the other. We'd go and have lunches together. And I found a summer job for him when he was 16, and he worked so hard. And that's what people would say, wow, what a worker he was. And he really put his mind to something that he wanted to do a good job on. He always did that. And he always wanted to be a Marine. I can't even remember when that started. It was just in him to be a United States Marine. And it was like, it's hard to see that that would happen, because he struggled with schooling and finishing school. He really, really struggled, but he got it done.
That dream of joining the Marines, it was a primary focus of Vladek's adolescence, and he was willing to do whatever he had to, buckling down to finish school and focusing on fitness to achieve it. Bethany told us that he also thought about the best place to live, too, since that could affect where he was assigned.
Joining the Marines was always a goal of his, even when he was really young. He would just talk about it and talk about his plans to be a Marine. And he worked really hard to be eligible. He really planned it out. He moved in with Carrie in Arlington, Texas for a year, so he would be eligible to go to San Diego for boot camp because he knew it would be wintertime and he doesn't like the snow. So he really thought it through and lived with Carrie so he could go to San Diego. And before the Marines, he really got fit and worked out long hours and special diets to get in shape before joining the Marines. And he was working a couple jobs at the time and just really determined. And he did it.
While in Texas with Carrie, Vlad worked everywhere from Six Flags to security at local sporting events, whatever could bring in income for himself and his sister, and he was able to be there for the birth of her first child. And his plan was successful. He eventually made it to San Diego, where he graduated from boot camp in December of 2018.
My family, a lot of us were able to fly out to San Diego, and the day before graduation is Family Day. It's the day that your first time being able to see your loved one before graduation and since they left for boot camp. So that was really special because it was also his birthday. So just being able to see the pride of all that he has accomplished, being able to go through boot camp and graduate and being able to be there to support him was really meaningful.
Bethany told us that her family hoped that Vlad would have a long and happy career with the Marines. But after a few months, she began to get the sense that something was wrong. It was difficult, though, to find out exactly what was bothering him. Cheryl said that she had the same experience.
He's always been one to guard what's going on with him. He's always been one to deflect. If something's bothering him, he'll kind of deflect the conversation to something else, and he doesn't want people to worry about him. So that has been a trait of his throughout, even into adulthood. Yeah, just a very private person. Like with strangers, he'll want to hear what you're about and your story and all that, but he's not one to divulge into his past and much about him, if that makes sense. And Vladek has a very active personality where he's always on the move, not one to stay in one spot. So he was given a desk position, and it's not what he had envisioned at all for his Marine career.
Vladek always thought he'd get like artillery and something hands-on, but they put him in more of a computer type situation, and he was disillusioned like that. He couldn't see himself in whatever they said he should do.
Bethany thinks it was more than the job. It may have been some aspects of military life, whether it was the tight structure or simply the organization of boot camp and the barracks that brought up early childhood memories of Russia for Vladek.
He spoke with higher ups and said that this wasn't the right fit for him and that it was all bringing up negative memories from his childhood in the orphanage. So they agreed to give him a discharge. They classified it under honorable conditions for failure to adapt. So after he left the Marines, that had always been his goal. There wasn't a plan B. Like that was it.
Bethany told us that after Vlad left the Marines, he had to reimagine what his life might look like.
So he really struggled to find his footing in the world. He applied to several jobs, would work a day, but it wasn't the right fit. So nothing ever really stuck. And then in beginning of 2020, he moved in with my sister Carrie again. And at this time they were in Detroit, Michigan. And she got him a job working at a hospital. And he did really well with that position. It was cleaning hospital rooms and assisting nurses with different things, kind of thing with cleaning up. COVID hit a couple months later, And we've been told Vladek was one of the first ones to volunteer to go into COVID positive rooms and clean them. And Carrie was a single mom at the time, so she had to take a leave of absence because daycares were closed. So she could stay home and watch her child. So Vladek would pick up more shifts and help financially support the three of them.
According to Bethany, Vlad and Carrie eventually left Michigan and spent some time living in New Hampshire. But Vladek wasn't happy there, so he returned to Florida. Cheryl told us that she was living in a community for people aged 55 and up, and that she wasn't allowed any long-term visitors below that age. So Vladek couldn't stay with her beyond short visits. So he went to live with his dad, Steve, and his new wife, but the arrangement was somewhat tense. When Steve and his wife eventually separated, he and Vlad moved out together. First, they went to hotels, and eventually they settled in their own apartment in Orlando in November of 2020. According to Night Owl Reconnaissance, the specific complex was the place at Alafaya. Cheryl explained that though she and Steve weren't in frequent contact during this period, she later learned that Vladek was exhibiting what the family now feels are signs of depression. He wasn't working at the time and was questioning a lot about life, his purpose, why society was so focused on material things, and why there was a lack of concern for people who have so little. Bethany said that their dad tried to be there for Vladek in whatever way was most helpful. They took a road trip together in 2020, and he shared his vehicle with his son. Mostly, though, Vladek spent his time alone, or seeking out people in Orlando who he thought might need help.
Dad didn't want to push him too much because he felt like he was going through, you know, periods of depression and he didn't want to put too much more on him. So he was okay with, financially supporting him with whatever he needed. And Vladek kind of took a turn and kind of found a purpose in the community where they lived. He started building friendships with the unhoused community, and there was an advocate that went to different homeless camps and spoke with different individuals in the unhoused community, and a couple of them, were sharing stories about Vladek and how one day Vladek would just drive up with a bag of Chick-fil-A sandwiches and start passing them out, and how like another couple people he took out to eat and covered their meal, and different restaurants that we would go to also remember him bringing individuals in and covering their meal, just things like that. And that was really giving Vladek a sense of purpose and helping him feel like he was able to give back to those around him. I feel like a lot of that stems from his childhood in Russia and the orphanage and the really tough stuff that he had to go through as a little child, and just finding ways to make others' lives a little brighter if he can.
He'd also begun watching a lot of religious programming on YouTube that focused on themes of angels and demons, and began speaking about spirituality in ways that seemed much more intense.
So we grew up in a Christian home, going to church almost every Sunday, midweek events, that kind of thing. As time went on and like during the time of COVID, a lot of things changed. And Vladek was living with my dad around that time, and they didn't want to go out as much. They didn't want to risk dad's health. So Vladek was watching more sermons online. And around the beginning of 2021 is when like it took on a whole new level. Like there was a lot of focus on heaven, and I'd say almost in an unhealthy way, where he would make comments of, if we can be in heaven, why don't we just be there? And he would say that, items, possessions, they're just a distraction from heaven. So he became very minimalistic. And when Dad and Vladek moved into that apartment, Dad was like, all right, let's get you a bed. Let's do this. And Vladek was like, I don't need a bed. And like he had like an air mattress. And Dad's like, yeah, you do. And they got this like bed in a box thing, but Vladek never opened it. It stayed in his closet and it was still there after he went missing. even though, as air mattresses do, it went flat months before he went missing, but he would still use that flat air mattress to sleep on. He wasn't focused on materialistic anymore, which was a drastic change from the Vladek I've known growing up. You know, the kid that would brag like, "Oh, it's okay if I don't have a case or a screen protector on my phone. If I drop it, I'll just get a new phone tomorrow." And how he would say, "I'm gonna have a Tesla one day," and the Michael Jordan shoes, and the name brand clothes. Like that's that's the Vladik I've known growing up, as most, teenage boys are, they want to dress to impress. But a lot of that changed the beginning of 2021, the year that Vlad went missing, and just trying to wrap my mind around it of how things changed so much so quickly. He really isolated himself from COVID on, as many of us did. He was constantly washing his hands, and I think part of that was to make sure nothing got back to my dad, but also Vlad, like, has a very, I don't know if OCD is the right word, but he likes things a certain way and to stay clean, and he's known to take a couple showers a day, like that kind of thing.
Bethany said that Vladek also gave away a number of his possessions and occasionally spent so much money on the people he met on the streets of Orlando that it put him in financial difficulty himself. There was one couple in particular that would call him repeatedly, harassing him. He finally had to get a new phone number. That's when he got the flip phone that his sisters begged him to carry so that they could keep up with him. He spoke of enjoying walks to a local church and spending time in their garden, or going to Foxtail Coffee, or watching sermons, or connecting with people he felt needed help. When he did talk about his own life, he sometimes discussed grand plans, like that hike of the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah. So with Vladek, with how he deflects, he also will say, he puts out testers. He will say something and see how people react to it, and then he'll say, "Oh, I'm just joking." Or just to kind of see how people take whatever he's talking about. So a lot of times he would just say big things, and he would say, "Ah, I don't mean any of that." We've had those kind of conversations, and at some point in 2021, he would start talking about how he wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail. And that seemed like another one of his big things that he'll say just to kind of throw it out there, kind of thing. And my dad and him were thinking about moving in with us to a house that we were about to rent. It was a 4-bedroom with me and Jody. And Vladek would say, "Oh, I don't need a room. I'm just gonna camp out in the backyard to get ready for the Appalachian Trail." And like they never ended up moving in with us or whatever. And a couple months before he went missing, we were making plans for my birthday trip to Tennessee, and Vladek was gonna go, and he would say like, "Oh, I'm gonna hike the Appalachian Trail and I'll meet you guys there." And I said, "Well, you better keep a phone on you, and you need to call at least once a week to make sure that you're okay." Like, just in case what he was saying he was real about. And he's like, "Oh no, I'm gonna be fine. I'll be fine. I'll be fine."
As far as his family knows, Vlad never made any solid plans to walk the Appalachian Trail. And at the last minute, he decided not to go with his family to Tennessee, a trip that they'd all planned to take in early November of 2021. That first week of the month, there are a few important details that we should note, things that his father, Steve, didn't realize would matter until later, after Vladek's disappearance. On November 3rd, Vladek purchased a pocket knife, which he told Steve he was going to start carrying with him as he walked around Orlando. He wanted to feel a little more secure, considering that he was on his own a lot. And Vlad also borrowed Steve's car that same day. According to Night Owl Reconnaissance, it broke down while he was driving, and he had to leave it at a nearby shopping center and walk the rest of the way home. Steve had the car towed to a nearby automotive shop for repair, which meant that while Steve was in Tennessee with family, Vlad would be without the use of their shared vehicle. He'd be on foot, which was nothing new to him. He'd also be carrying his new pocket knife. On November 4th, Vladek walked to Foxtail Coffee, something that he did several days a week. As we told you at the top of the episode, patrons had occasionally complained about his behavior to the staff. He'd never directly bothered anyone, but we're told by the family, and we've also read in various media reports, that Vlad had been known to pace and to sometimes play music or videos too loud on his devices, though he often wore headphones. On the 4th, a customer did apparently complain to the staff. We've read a few different versions of what happened, but according to Bethany, the customer explained that Vladek was making them uncomfortable and that they were planning on leaving. The customer apparently did leave, and so did Vladek. Per night-owl reconnaissance, the customer returned later and advised that Vladek had placed a pocket knife on the table. The facility's management staff stated, quote, "None of the employees witnessed the knife incident, and there was no surveillance footage of the encounter. But it was at that point that the staff decided that the next time Vladek came to Foxtail, he would be permanently trespassed from the premises. He didn't know, of course, that anything was wrong." The next morning, November 5th, Steve made sure Vladek had enough money to cover his expenses while the family was out of town, a credit card and about $100 in cash. Bethany said they'd be gone for more than a week and that her father was expecting a package to be delivered on November 8th. Vladek promised he'd pick it up and bring it inside as soon as it arrived. The family was traveling to the mountains, and it might be difficult to reach them by phone or by text. Not that Vladek was always good about answering. Cheryl, who was going on the trip as well, was concerned about Vladek staying behind, but she said he was insistent on it. So she said goodbye, and she told him to be careful.
But Vladek, we wanted him to go along, and there he was standing in the parking lot. That's the last time I saw him. And he said, "No, Mom, I just want to stay. There's a couple things I want to do, and I don't want to take this trip today." And I just gave him a big hug and said, "I love you." He said, "I love you too, Mom." Big squeeze, and that's the last time I saw him.
When the Hasels left on November 5th, they had no idea that when Vladek returned to Foxtail Coffee the next day, the police would be called, and he'd be issued a trespass order. As we told you, the interaction was uneventful at the shop. Vladek was polite, and he left without incident. That's proven through body cam footage. And his family understands why the order was issued, though Vladek hadn't done anything violent or threatening. Their worry was for the effect that it might have had on Vladek's already fragile stability. His routine was one of the few things he had that fall, and it had been suddenly and irrevocably shifted. But they wouldn't know that Vladek had been issued that trespass order, not for months. And they had no idea anything was wrong until they returned on November 15th, 2021. That's when they realized Vladek was gone, and that he might have been missing for days. But for how long? That's a question they've been trying to answer ever since. Next time on The Fall Line, possible sightings of Vladek in the days after the Foxtail Coffee event, his family's discovery of his disappearance, and their attempts to locate him, and to seek the help of law enforcement, media, and the public. At the time of his disappearance, Bryan Vladek Hasel was 22 years old. He'd be 27 today. He's 5'8" and around 220 pounds, with dirty blonde hair and blue eyes. We have Vladek's photo posted to our social media. If you see someone matching Vladek's description, his family asks that you not make direct contact. Instead, reach out to the Orlando County Sheriff's Office at 404-254-7000. Vladek loves coffee shops and basketball, has an interest in the Appalachian Trail, and could be living in the unhoused community. He's traveled across the U.S. and is familiar with various states, including Texas, Florida, New Hampshire, California, and Michigan, but could be living anywhere. To follow his family's social media accounts and stay up to date on search efforts, please check the links in our show notes. And if you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. Our therapy fund is paid for through Patreon and Apple Premium subscriptions. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure you're set for automatic downloads so you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Engineered by Southern Gothic Media and Rachel Boyd. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka. We'd also like to thank Haley Gray for sharing her additional interview notes.